They called her defective, a woman flawed in the one way that mattered most, her ability to become a mother. In the marble lobby of the Ashford estate, surrounded by portraits of generations she would never contribute to, Vivian Harper signed the last page that erased 8 years of her life. The pen felt heavier than it should have, gold-plated, expensive, cold against her fingers, like everything else in that family. Her ex-mother-in-law had chosen those words carefully. A woman who cannot provide an heir has no place in this lineage. The divorce papers didn't mention love, or the quiet dinners where she'd tried so hard to belong, or the nursery she'd painted 3 times in 3 different shades of hope. She had extinguished hope completely, even though the doctor said it was difficult for her, not impossible. But what the Ashford family discarded like a defective item would shine somewhere else, and a man who had sworn never to trust women, raising 3 children who had never known a mother's touch, would see perfect beauty in that very incompleteness. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of the law office, catching dust particles that drifted like tiny worlds with nowhere to land. Vivian sat perfectly still in the leather chair, her hands folded in her lap, watching her lawyer arrange the final documents into a neat stack. Gregory hadn't bothered to come. He'd sent his attorney instead, a man with salt and pepper hair who kept checking his watch as if this dissolution of 8 years could be squeezed between lunch and his next appointment. Outside, Boston moved at its usual October pace, people rushing with coffee cups, leaves skittering across sidewalks, everyone heading somewhere that mattered. Vivian wondered if she'd ever feel like she was heading somewhere again. The diagnosis had come 3 months earlier, delivered by a fertility specialist in an office that smelled like lavender and false comfort. Your chances of conceiving naturally are extremely low, the doctor had said, her voice professionally sympathetic. Not impossible, but we'd be looking at perhaps a 2 to 3% probability. Vivian had sat there, Gregory beside her, feeling something fundamental crack inside her chest. She'd expected him to reach for her hand. Instead, he'd pulled out his phone and started typing. That night at dinner, his mother had appeared at their door unannounced, which should have been Vivian's first warning. Margaret Ashford didn't make social calls. She made pronouncements. "We've been patient," Margaret had said, standing in their foyer like a queen in enemy territory. 8 years, Vivian. 8 years of waiting for you to fulfill your primary obligation to this family. The words had been delivered with such clinical precision that Vivian almost admired the cruelty of it. Gregory had stood behind his mother, silent, and in that silence, Vivian heard everything she needed to know. The marriage had been a transaction from the start, her family's political connections in exchange for the Ashford name and money, a business arrangement dressed up in wedding whites. And now that she couldn't deliver on the unspoken terms, the contract was void. "I married you because your father's firm handled contracts worth millions," Gregory had finally said. 3 weeks before the divorce papers arrived. They were in the kitchen, the same kitchen where Vivian had tried to create something resembling a home, and his voice was so matter-of-fact that it took her a moment to process what he was saying. "My career needed that boost. You were supposed to be the complete package, connections, and a family. Now you're just—" He'd trailed off, but Vivian had finished the sentence in her head. Broken. Defective. Not enough. She'd spent the next 2 weeks in a kind of fog, moving through the Ashford house like a ghost, haunting her own life. The nursery she'd prepared sat empty on the 3rd floor, its walls painted in soft yellow. The first attempt. Then sage green. The second. Finally, the palest blue. The 3rd and last. Each color had represented a new round of hope, a new doctor, a new possibility. Now, it just represented her failure. When the movers came to pack her things, Margaret had watched from the doorway, arms crossed. "You understand this is for the best," she'd said. And Vivian had understood that what she meant was, "You understand, you never really belonged here." The lawyer slid the papers across the desk. "Sign here, here, and initial here," he said, tapping each line with his pen. Vivian picked up the gold-plated Mont Blanc, Gregory's pen, left behind like everything else he didn't want, and signed her name 3 times. Vivian Harper. Not Vivian Ashford. She'd never really been an Ashford anyway. The ink dried quickly, permanent and irreversible. "That's everything," the lawyer said, already standing, already done with her. "You'll receive the settlement transfer within 5 business days." Vivian nodded, gathered her coat, and walked out into the October afternoon, where the light was already beginning to fade. She went home to the small apartment she'd rented in Back Bay, a place so different from the Ashford mansion that it felt like stepping into someone else's life. 2 rooms, barely furnished, with windows that looked out onto a fire escape instead of manicured gardens. But it was hers. She made tea, sat by the window, and watched the city lights come on one by one as darkness settled over Boston. Somewhere in the middle of her second cup, she started to cry. Not the dramatic, sobbing kind of tears she'd imagined, but quiet, steady streams that fell without sound. 8 years. Gone. And the worst part wasn't losing Gregory. It was losing the version of herself she'd tried so hard to become. The perfect wife, the future mother. The woman who fit into gilded frames and family trees. That woman had never existed. Vivian was just beginning to understand that maybe that was okay. The letter from her grandmother arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by a lawyer she didn't recognize. Vivian almost didn't open it. She'd had enough of lawyers and legal documents for a lifetime. But something about the envelope, thick cream paper, her name written in fountain pen, made her pause. Inside was a letter and a bank statement that made her sit down hard on her couch. $15 million. Her grandmother Eleanor, who'd passed away 6 months before the divorce, had left her entire estate to Vivian. The letter was brief, written in Eleanor's firm, elegant hand. "My dear girl, your worth has never been measured in what you can produce for others. It's measured in what you choose to create for yourself. Don't let them convince you otherwise. Build something beautiful. Build something that matters. Build something that would make those fools realize what they lost." Vivian read the letter 3 times, then 4, then pressed it against her chest and cried again. But this time, something else mixed with the grief. Something that felt almost like possibility. Her grandmother had always been different from the rest of the family. Tougher, more independent. She'd built her own fortune in real estate when women weren't supposed to do such things, and she'd never apologized for taking up space in rooms that didn't want her. "They'll always find something wrong with you," Eleanor had told Vivian once, years ago. "Too ambitious, or not ambitious enough. Too loud, or too quiet. Give them babies, or don't give them babies. It won't matter. They'll always find the flaw, so you might as well stop trying to be flawless and start trying to be free." Freedom. Vivian turned the word over in her mind, like a stone she was learning to hold. What did freedom look like for someone who'd spent 8 years learning to disappear? She spent the next week walking through Boston, past the brownstones and the Common, past the places where she and Gregory had pretended to be happy, past the restaurants where his family had held their insufferable dinners. She walked until her feet hurt and her mind cleared, and somewhere around the public garden, watching parents push strollers and children feed ducks, she understood what she wanted to do. She couldn't be a mother herself, or the odds were so impossibly stacked against her that it felt the same. But she could help children who needed someone. She could help families who were struggling. She could take this inheritance, this gift from a grandmother who'd seen her worth when no one else did, and turn it into something that mattered. Harper's Heart Foundation was registered as a non-profit 6 weeks later. Vivian poured herself into the work with an intensity that surprised her. She leased a small office in downtown Boston, hired 2 staff members, and started reaching out to organizations that worked with foster children, single-parent families, and kids who'd aged out of the system. The foundation would provide financial support, mentorship programs, and emergency assistance. It would be everything Vivian wished she could be: a safety net, a second chance, a way to say, "You are not broken just because your life doesn't look like everyone else's." The local paper ran a small article about the foundation. A few donors reached out. And slowly, carefully, Vivian began to feel like she was building something real. Something that couldn't be taken away by a failed marriage or a disappointing medical report. She started going to the office every day, even when there wasn't much to do yet. It felt good to have a place to go, a purpose that didn't depend on fitting into someone else's expectations. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Rachel, handled the calls and paperwork with cheerful efficiency. "You've got a meeting at 2, Rachel said one morning in early spring, 6 months after the foundation had opened. Anonymous donor. He's been funding children's charities for years, apparently. Wants to discuss a major contribution. Vivian looked up from her laptop, surprised. They'd received small donations, a few thousand here and there, but nothing that qualified as major. How major? She asked. Rachel grinned. He's offering $500,000 to start. Could be more if the partnership works out. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock, but the donor arrived at 1:45. Vivian heard his voice in the outer office first, low, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. When he walked into her office, she stood automatically, smoothing her skirt, suddenly aware of how small her operation must seem to someone who donated in 6 figures. He was tall, probably in his early 40s, with dark hair starting to silver at the temples, and the kind of severe, handsome face that looked like it didn't smile often. His suit was expensive but not showy, charcoal gray with a tie that matched his eyes. "Nathaniel Breslin," he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm, brief, professional. "Thank you for seeing me on short notice." "Of course," Vivian said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "Please, sit. Can I get you coffee? Water?" He shook his head and sat, pulling a leather portfolio from his briefcase with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "I'll get straight to the point," he said, opening the portfolio to reveal what looked like a detailed proposal. "I want to fund a gala for your foundation, a major fundraising event that would bring in substantial donations and raise your profile in the city. I'll cover all costs, venue, catering, marketing, everything. I just need you to coordinate it." Vivian blinked, momentarily thrown. "That's incredibly generous. But why? I mean, we're still fairly new. There are larger, more established charities. I've looked into those," Nathaniel interrupted, his tone flat but not unkind. "They're top-heavy with administrative costs and board members who treat charity like a social hobby. Your foundation puts 92 cents of every dollar directly into programs. That's what I care about. Results, not galas and photo opportunities." He paused, seeming to consider whether to say more, then continued. "I'm funding this because I believe in what you're doing. Single parents, children without stable homes, they need more than thoughts and prayers. They need actual support. So, are you interested?" Vivian studied him, trying to read past the controlled exterior. There was something almost defensive in the way he held himself, like he was prepared for her to refuse or question his motives. "I'm interested," she said carefully. "But I need to understand what you're expecting in return. Nothing this generous comes without strings." For the first time, something that might have been approval flickered across his face. "Smart," he said. "The string is this. I remain anonymous. The event is hosted by Harper's Heart Foundation. My name doesn't appear on any materials, any press releases, anywhere. I fund it, you run it, and the focus stays on the children and families you're helping. That's the only condition." "Why anonymous?" Vivian asked, genuinely curious. Most major donors wanted their names in headlines, on building plaques, attached to tax deductions and social capital. Nathaniel closed his portfolio with a decisive snap. "Because I don't do this for recognition. I do it because—" He stopped, jaw tightening as if he'd said more than he intended. "I have my reasons. Do we have an agreement?" There was something in his eyes when he said it, something that looked almost like pain, quickly shuddered. Vivian found herself nodding before she'd fully thought it through. "Yes, we have an agreement." Nathaniel stood, extending his hand again. "Good. I'll have my assistant send over the initial details. We can meet weekly to coordinate. Is Thursday at 10 workable for you?" Vivian stood as well, shaking his hand. "Thursday's fine." He left as abruptly as he'd arrived, and Vivian sank back into her chair, her mind racing. Rachel appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. Did that just happen? Did a stranger just offer to fund an entire gala? Vivian laughed, a little breathless. "I think he did." Rachel leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "He's intense. Barely cracked a smile the entire time he was here. But there's something about him, right? Like he's carrying something heavy and refusing to put it down." Vivian thought about the way Nathaniel's expression had closed off when she'd asked about anonymity, the careful control in every word and gesture. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Something like that." The Thursday meetings became a routine over the next month. Nathaniel arrived exactly on time, never early or late, with detailed notes and suggestions that showed he'd done his homework. He knew the nonprofit world intimately, which vendors were reliable, which venues offered nonprofit discounts, which caterers wouldn't cut corners. He spoke with the clipped efficiency of someone who'd learned to manage his time down to the minute, and he never stayed longer than necessary. Vivian found herself oddly fascinated by him. He was nothing like Gregory, who'd been charming and expansive and utterly false. Nathaniel didn't bother with charm. He stated facts, made decisions, and expected competence. It was almost refreshing. "You're very good at this," Vivian said during their fourth meeting, after he'd walked her through a comprehensive marketing strategy. "Have you organized events before?" Nathaniel glanced up from his laptop, his expression unreadable. "I've funded plenty. Running them is usually someone else's job, but I've learned what works." He paused, then added with what might have been dry humor. "And what doesn't? Never serve chicken at a charity gala. It's either overcooked or undercooked, and either way, people remember." Vivian smiled despite herself. "Noted. No chicken." It was the first moment of anything resembling ease between them, and it passed quickly. Nathaniel returned his attention to his screen, the wall going back up. But something had shifted, just slightly. Over the following weeks, their meetings stretched longer. Nathaniel started arriving with coffee. One for him, one for Vivian. Always the same order she'd mentioned offhandedly 3 weeks prior. He remembered details, names of staff members, dates of programs, small things Vivian had said in passing. He never commented on it, never drew attention to his own attentiveness, but Vivian noticed. She also noticed the way he checked his watch obsessively after the 30-minute mark of every meeting, the way his jaw tightened when his phone buzzed, the way he seemed perpetually on the edge of leaving even when he'd just arrived. There was something restless about him, something caged. It was during their 7th meeting, late on a Thursday afternoon in May, when everything changed. They were reviewing the final guest list when Nathaniel's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time since Vivian had met him, he looked genuinely worried. "I need to take this," he said, standing abruptly and stepping into the hallway. Vivian couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see him through the glass office door, pacing, running a hand through his hair, his entire posture radiating tension. When he came back, his face was tight. "I have to go. Family emergency." He was already packing his laptop, movements sharp and hurried. "Is everything okay?" Vivian asked, standing. Nathaniel paused, seeming to weigh whether to answer. "My nanny just quit. Effective immediately, and I have a board meeting in an hour that I can't miss." He said it like he was admitting defeat, and Vivian suddenly understood that this controlled, competent man was on the verge of actual panic. "You have kids?" she asked, surprised. He'd never mentioned children, never mentioned anything personal. Nathaniel looked at her like he was calculating risk, then nodded once. 3, 9, 7, and 5. They're home alone right now, which is... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Vivian made the decision before she could overthink it. "I'll go," she said. "Give me your address. I'll stay with them until you're done with your meeting." Nathaniel stared at her like she'd just offered to walk on water. "You don't have to do that." But there was something almost desperate in the way he said it, like he was hoping she'd insist. "I know," Vivian said, grabbing her coat. "But I want to. It's what the foundation is about, right? Helping families when they need it. Consider this a trial run." Nathaniel hesitated for only a moment longer, then pulled out his phone and texted her an address in Beacon Hill. "Thank you," he said, and the gratitude in his voice was so raw and unguarded that Vivian had to look away. The penthouse was exactly what she'd expected, and nothing like she'd imagined at the same time. High ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, furniture that looked expensive, but somehow sterile. It was beautiful in the way museums were beautiful, impressive, but not lived in. Nathaniel unlocked the door and called out, "Elijah, Claire, Owen, someone's here to stay with you for a few hours." 3 faces appeared from different rooms, cautious and curious. The oldest, Elijah, had his father's dark hair and serious eyes. Claire was all freckles and tangled braids, her expression guarded. Owen, the youngest, held a stuffed dinosaur and stared at Vivian like she might disappear if he blinked. "This is Vivian," Nathaniel said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "She's going to make sure you're okay while I'm at my meeting. Listen to her, be good, and I'll be back by dinner time." He looked at Vivian, and something in his expression reminded her of a soldier heading into battle. "They've eaten lunch. Emergency numbers are on the fridge. If anything happens, anything, call me immediately." Vivian nodded, and Nathaniel crouched down to be eye level with his kids. He said something too quiet for her to hear, then straightened and left without looking back. The door clicked shut, and suddenly Vivian was alone with 3 children who were staring at her like she was a puzzle they hadn't agreed to solve. "So," Vivian said, setting her bag down and trying for cheerful, "what do you guys usually do on Thursday afternoons?" Silence. Then Owen, clutching his dinosaur tighter, asked in a small voice, "Are you Dad's girlfriend?" Vivian blinked, caught off guard. "No, sweetie, I'm your dad's friend. We work together." Claire crossed her arms, skeptical. "Dad doesn't have friends. He has business meetings." It was said with such matter-of-fact certainty that Vivian didn't know whether to laugh or feel sad. "Well," she said carefully, "maybe I'm his first friend, the kind who helps out when things get complicated." Elijah, who'd been watching this exchange with the wary intelligence of someone used to reading adults, finally spoke. "Why did you come? People don't usually help us." The question hit Vivian harder than it should have. These were children who'd learned not to expect kindness from strangers, children who'd been raised to be self-sufficient, because depending on others meant disappointment. "I came because your dad needed help," Vivian said simply. and because I wanted to meet you. He talks about you sometimes during our meetings. That was a stretch. Nathaniel barely talked about anything personal, but it made Claire's expression soften just slightly. He does? She asked, and Vivian could hear the hunger for proof that they mattered in her voice. He does, Vivian confirmed. He mentions that Elijah is really good at math, and Claire loves to draw, and Owen asks the best questions. Owen's eyes went wide. Dad said that. Vivian smiled. He did. It was a small lie in service of a larger truth. These kids needed to know they were seen, loved, thought about. Owen's grip on his dinosaur relaxed a fraction. Claire uncrossed her arms, and Elijah, after a long moment of consideration, asked, "Do you know how to make cookies?" 2 hours later, the kitchen was a disaster zone of flour and chocolate chips, and Vivian was laughing harder than she had in months. Owen had somehow gotten cookie dough in his hair. Claire was decorating her cookies with intense artistic focus, and Elijah, who'd initially claimed he was too old for baking, was carefully measuring ingredients for a second batch. "My grandma used to bake with me," Vivian said, rolling out dough beside Claire. "She said the best cookies are the ones made with people you love." Claire looked up at her, something vulnerable flickering across her face. "We don't have a grandma, or a mom, just Dad." Vivian's hand stilled on the rolling pin. "Just your dad?" she asked gently. Owen piped up from his spot at the counter, where he was eating chocolate chips straight from the bag. "Dad says we don't need a mom because he takes care of us really good. But sometimes I wonder what moms are like." He said it so casually, like he was wondering what dinosaurs tasted like or why the sky was blue, a question without real hope of an answer. Claire added quietly, "We were born different. Dad picked us special from ladies who helped, but they're not our moms. We don't really have moms." Vivian felt something crack open in her chest. These children had never known a mother's touch, never had someone to braid Claire's hair properly, or read Owen bedtime stories, or tell Elijah he didn't always have to be so serious. "Your dad loves you very much," Vivian said, because it was the only thing she knew for certain. "I can see that." Elijah nodded, solemn. "He does. He works really hard so we can have everything. But—" He trailed off and Vivian waited. "But sometimes I think he's lonely." "And we're lonely too, even though we have each other. It's like something's missing, but we don't know what it's supposed to be." The cookies were cooling on the rack when Nathaniel's key turned in the lock. He walked in, still in his suit, looking exhausted, and then stopped dead when he saw the scene before him. His kids, covered in flour and chocolate and grinning. Vivian, hair tied back with a kitchen towel tucked into her belt, laughing at something Owen had just said. The whole apartment warm and loud and alive in a way it clearly hadn't been in a long time. Owen spotted him first and ran over, waving a cookie. "Dad, we made cookies. Miss Vivian helped, and she's really nice, and she told us you think I ask good questions." Nathaniel caught his youngest son against his legs, his expression doing something complicated, softening and tightening at the same time. His eyes found Vivian's across the kitchen, and in them she saw something she recognized, a person who'd been holding everything together for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to not carry the weight alone. "Thank you," he said, and it sounded like so much more than gratitude for an afternoon of babysitting. Claire appeared at his elbow, tugging his sleeve. "Can Miss Vivian come back? Please. She's not like the nannies. She's—" Claire struggled for the word, then settled on. "She's like if a friend was also kind of like a mom, but not scary." Vivian's heart did something painful and sweet at the same time. Nathaniel looked at his daughter, then back at Vivian, and she saw the exact moment he realized he was standing at a crossroads he hadn't known he was approaching. "That's up to Vivian," he said carefully. "She has her own life, her own work, She was helping us out in an emergency. But Vivian was already nodding before he finished speaking, because something in this strange, sterile apartment full of brilliant, hungry children had woken up a part of her she thought the Ashfords had killed. "I'd like to come back," she said, "if that's okay with you." Nathaniel held her gaze for a long moment, and Vivian watched him calculate risk and reward, weighing the danger of letting someone in against the clear hunger in his children's eyes. Finally, slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he said. "Okay." That okay became a routine. Vivian started coming to the penthouse twice a week after work, sometimes more when Nathaniel's schedule demanded it. She'd arrive to find the kids doing homework or fighting over the remote or building elaborate pillow forts that violated every principle of structural engineering. She'd make dinner, actual home-cooked meals instead of the takeout Nathaniel usually ordered. She'd help with math homework and listen to Claire's rambling stories about school and play dinosaurs with Owen until her knees hurt from crawling around the living room. And slowly, week by week, the penthouse began to feel less like a museum and more like a home. Nathaniel remained carefully distant, always professional, always controlled. But Vivian noticed small changes. He started coming home earlier on the nights she was there, claiming he'd moved meetings, but really just wanting to be present. He'd linger in the kitchen while she cooked, asking questions about her day, offering small pieces of his own life in return. He'd started laughing at Owen's jokes instead of just smiling. He'd stopped checking his watch every 5 minutes. He was, Vivian realized, learning how to be human again. Or maybe for the first time. It was Elijah who forced the conversation that had been building for months. They were sitting at the kitchen table one evening, in late September, nearly 6 months after that first afternoon of emergency babysitting. Nathaniel had just gotten home, and Vivian was packing up to leave. Elijah looked up from his homework and said, with the blunt honesty of a 9-year-old who'd been thinking too hard about something, "Dad, why don't you marry Miss Vivian?" The kitchen went very quiet. Claire looked up from her drawing. Eyes wide, Owen stopped playing with his dinosaurs. Nathaniel froze halfway through loosening his tie, and Vivian felt her face go hot. "Elijah," Nathaniel said carefully, "that's not how adult relationships work. Miss Vivian and I are friends. We work together." But Elijah wasn't backing down. He had his father's intensity, and right now, it was focused, like a laser. "But you like her. We can tell. And she likes us. Claire heard you on the phone telling Uncle James that Miss Vivian made you remember what it felt like to not be alone." The silence that followed was so complete, Vivian could hear her own heartbeat. Nathaniel's face did something complicated. Embarrassment, frustration, and something else. Something vulnerable. He looked at Vivian, and she saw him weighing how much truth he could afford to speak in front of his children. "Yes," he said finally, his voice low. "I like Vivian very much, but it's complicated. There are things you don't understand yet." Claire put down her colored pencil, her small face very serious. "Is it because of the mom who left you? The one in the picture you keep hidden?" Nathaniel went still in a way that made Vivian's chest hurt. "How do you know about that?" he asked quietly. "I found it when I was looking for tape," Claire said, unapologetic. "It was in your desk drawer. You were little in the picture, and there was a lady, and she was smiling. But you don't have any other pictures of her anywhere, so I thought maybe she left, and that's why you don't want anyone else to leave us either." Nathaniel sat down hard in the nearest chair, and Vivian saw every carefully constructed wall he'd built start to crack. "My mother left when I was 12, he said, and his voice was so different from his usual controlled tone that all 3 kids went silent. She left my father and me for someone else, someone she thought would make her happier, and it broke something in me. I decided I'd never let anyone have that power again, the power to leave and destroy what I'd built. So when I wanted children, I chose to have them a different way. A way where I didn't have to trust someone to stay. Owen climbed into his father's lap, dinosaur and all. "But you trust Miss Vivian," he said simply. "We can tell." Nathaniel's arms came around his youngest son automatically, but his eyes were on Vivian. "I do," he admitted, "and that terrifies me." Vivian felt the words settle into her chest like stones, heavy and real. She'd been dancing around her own feelings for months, telling herself this was just volunteer work, just friendship, just helping a family in need. But the truth was that she'd fallen in love with these children and their guarded, brilliant father, who'd taught himself to live without softness because softness had betrayed him once. "I'm scared too," Vivian said, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. "My ex-husband left me because I couldn't give him children. His family made it very clear that I was defective, broken, not enough. I spent 8 years trying to be perfect for people who only saw my flaws. And when I couldn't be what they wanted, they threw me away." She looked at the 3 kids who were watching her with complete attention. "But you 3 have taught me something important. Being a mother isn't about biology. It's about showing up. It's about loving someone enough to braid their hair even when they squirm, and helping with homework, and making cookies, and being there when things are hard. I can't promise I'll ever be able to give your father more children, but I can promise that if you'd let me, I would love all of you, all 4 of you, exactly as you are." Claire was off her chair and hugging Vivian before she'd finished speaking. Owen scrambled out of Nathaniel's lap to join his sister, and Elijah, the careful one, the one who'd learned to protect himself with logic and distance, said quietly, "We'd like that. A lot." Vivian held them, these children who'd never had a mother, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. She looked over their heads at Nathaniel, who was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, wonder, maybe, or fear, or possibly both at once. He stood slowly and walked over to where Vivian was surrounded by his children. "I don't know how to do this," he said, his voice raw. "I don't know how to trust that you won't wake up one day and realize we're too complicated, too much work, not worth the effort." Vivian reached out with one hand, the other still holding Claire, and touched his face gently. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I'm not your mother. I'm not the people who hurt you. I'm someone who sees you and your kids and thinks, this is what I want. This is enough. This is more than enough." Nathaniel closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were wet. "I need you to understand something," he said. "I did this. The surrogacy. The single parenting, all of it. Because I was convinced that women couldn't be trusted, that they'd always leave, always choose themselves over the people who needed them. I was so angry at my mother for so long that I built my entire life around never being vulnerable again." He paused, his hand coming up to cover Vivian's, where it rested against his cheek. "But you've been here for 6 months, and you keep showing up. You keep choosing us. And I'm starting to think that maybe I was wrong about everything." The gala happened on a crisp Saturday evening in October, exactly 1 year after Vivian had signed her divorce papers. The venue was stunning, a historic building with crystal chandeliers and sweeping staircases. Donors in evening wear filled the ballroom, and Harper's Heart Foundation's work was displayed on screens throughout the space. It was everything they'd planned, and it was perfect. Vivian moved through the crowd in a simple navy dress, accepting congratulations, shaking hands, feeling like she was watching herself from a distance. This was supposed to be her triumph, the proof that she'd built something meaningful. But all she could think about was Nathaniel, who was somewhere in this crowd staying carefully anonymous, and the 3 kids he'd surprised her by bringing. She found them on the balcony, away from the noise. Elijah wore a suit that made him look impossibly grown up. Claire had insisted on a dress with pockets, and currently had them stuffed with appetizers. Owen was holding Nathaniel's hand, his free arm wrapped around his stuffed dinosaur, despite his father's gentle suggestion that maybe the dinosaur could stay home tonight. Nathaniel saw her first, and something in his expression made her heart stutter. He was looking at her the way she'd once dreamed Gregory would look at her, like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his entire life. "You came," Vivian said, smiling at the kids. Claire ran over and hugged her waist. "We had to see you being fancy," she announced. "Dad said you worked really hard, and we should be here to celebrate." Elijah added more quietly, "And because we wanted to. You look really pretty, Miss Vivian." Owen just held up his dinosaur, which Vivian had learned meant he was happy, but didn't have words for it. Nathaniel stepped closer, his hands in his pockets. His shoulders relaxed in a way they never used to be. "You did an incredible job," he said. "The foundation, this event, all of it. You should be proud." Vivian felt tears prick her eyes, which was ridiculous because this was a celebration, not a moment for crying. But something about standing here with the 4 of them, away from the crowd, feeling like maybe she'd finally found where she belonged, it was overwhelming in the best possible way. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said to Nathaniel. "Any of it." He shook his head slowly. "You could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to." Around them, the sounds of the gala drifted through the open doors, music and laughter, and the clink of glasses. Inside, people were celebrating success and charity and the idea of helping others. Out here, Vivian was standing with a man who'd taught himself not to need anyone and 3 children who'd never known a mother's love, and she thought, this is what family looks like. Not perfect, not traditional, but real. The proposal came 2 weeks later, in the least romantic setting imaginable, the kitchen of Nathaniel's penthouse, on a Tuesday evening, with all 3 kids allegedly doing homework, but actually eavesdropping from the next room. Vivian was washing dishes, and Nathaniel was drying them, and it was so wonderfully domestic and ordinary that she didn't notice him stop moving until he said her name. She looked over, hands still soapy, and found him holding a small velvet box. "This isn't how I planned to do this," he said, looking almost embarrassed. "I had this whole thing worked out. A nice restaurant, the right words, getting down on one knee like you're supposed to. But then I was standing here, watching you wash dishes in my kitchen, humming to yourself, and I realized that this is the moment that matters. Not the performance, just us. Here." He opened the box to reveal a simple platinum band with a single diamond. Nothing like the ostentatious ring Gregory had given her, which had been more about showing off wealth than symbolizing commitment. This was elegant and understated, and somehow exactly right. "I'm still learning how to do this," Nathaniel continued, his voice steady, but his hand slightly shaking. "How to trust, how to let someone in, how to believe that not everyone leaves. You've been patient with me, with my kids, with all the ways we're complicated and difficult. You've shown up every single time, even when I gave you reasons to walk away, and I don't want to waste any more time being afraid." He took a breath. "Vivian Harper, will you marry me? Will you be Owen's mom, and Claire's mom, and Elijah's mom, and my wife, and the person we choose every single day for the rest of our lives?" Vivian couldn't speak. She pulled her hands out of the soapy water, dried them on a towel, and then took the box from him with shaking fingers. "Yes," she managed. "Yes, absolutely, yes." From the living room came the unmistakable sounds of 3 children trying very hard not to cheer too loudly and failing completely. Nathaniel laughed, a real, full laugh that made him look younger and lighter than she'd ever seen him, and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Of course it did. He'd probably measured her finger while she was sleeping. Because that's the kind of thorough, slightly obsessive thing he'd do. And she loved him for it. She loved him for all of it. His intensity, his fear, his slowly unfolding capacity for trust, his fierce love for his children, and the way he'd looked at her brokenness and seen wholeness instead. They were married in May, in a small ceremony at the park, where Vivian used to walk after her divorce, trying to figure out who she was without the Ashford name. Claire was the flower girl and took her job with intense seriousness. Owen was the ring bearer and only dropped the rings once. Elijah stood beside his father, solemn and proud, and when the officiant asked if anyone objected, he'd said loudly, "We definitely don't object. This is the best thing that's ever happened to us," which made everyone laugh and several people cry. Vivian wore a simple cream dress and carried wildflowers. Nathaniel wore a gray suit and looked at her like she'd hung the moon. And when they kissed after the vows, their children cheered so loudly that birds scattered from nearby trees. The first 3 months of marriage were an adjustment. Vivian moved into the penthouse, which suddenly felt less sterile and more lived in with her books and plants, and the cheerful chaos she brought. She and Nathaniel learned how to navigate sharing space, sharing decisions, sharing the enormous responsibility of raising 3 children who were testing boundaries and looking for reassurance that this new stability was real. There were hard moments, nights when Nathaniel's old fears resurfaced and he pulled away, and Vivian had to remind him that she wasn't leaving. Moments when the kids acted out because they were scared this happiness wouldn't last. But there were more good moments. So many more. Family dinners, homework help, Saturday morning cartoons, bedtime stories, the ordinary, beautiful, mundane work of being a family. It was early August, 3 months after the wedding, when Vivian woke up feeling strange. Not sick, exactly, but off in a way she couldn't name. She lay in bed for a moment, watching morning light filter through the curtains, listening to Nathaniel's steady breathing beside her. The feeling persisted through breakfast, through getting the kids ready for their day camp, through her morning at the foundation office. By lunchtime, she'd convinced herself she was coming down with something. By mid-afternoon, a different possibility occurred to her, one so unlikely that she almost dismissed it immediately. But it wouldn't leave her alone, this small, bright what-if that she'd trained herself not to think about years ago. She stopped at a pharmacy on the way home, bought a pregnancy test with shaking hands, and took it into the bathroom before anyone was home. 2 minutes, the box said. Vivian sat on the edge of the bathtub and watched the seconds tick by on her watch. She thought about the doctor's words. Extremely low chance, not impossible. She thought about Gregory's face when they'd gotten that news, the way he'd looked at her, like she'd betrayed him by being imperfect. She thought about Nathaniel's steady voice. "I don't need more children. I need you." And then the timer went off, and she picked up the test with hands that wouldn't stay steady, and there they were. 2 lines, clear and unmistakable, impossible, real. Vivian sat down hard on the bathroom floor, test clutched in both hands, and started crying. Not sad tears or scared tears, but the kind of crying that comes when your body doesn't know what else to do with overwhelming emotion. She'd made peace with not being able to have biological children. She'd learned to find meaning and purpose in other ways. She'd fallen in love with 3 kids who weren't hers by blood, but were absolutely hers by choice. And now this miracle she'd stopped praying for, was happening anyway. She didn't know how long she sat there, but eventually she heard the front door open and Nathaniel's voice calling her name. She stood up, splashed water on her face, and tried to figure out how to say what she needed to say. That evening, after the kids were in bed, Vivian found a small gift box and put the pregnancy test inside. She wrapped it in simple brown paper, tied it with string, and brought it to the living room where Nathaniel was reading. "I have something for you," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. He looked up, curious, and set his book aside. "It's not my birthday," he said, taking the box. "Or our anniversary." Vivian sat beside him on the couch, tucking her feet under her. "I know. Just open it." He untied the string carefully. Nathaniel never rushed things, and lifted the lid. His hand stopped moving. He stared at the test for a long moment, then looked at Vivian with an expression she couldn't read. "Is this—" He stopped, tried again. "Are you—" "Pregnant," Vivian finished. "I'm pregnant. The doctor said it was extremely unlikely, but not impossible. Apparently, we hit the extremely unlikely jackpot." She was trying for light, for humor, but her voice cracked on the last word. Nathaniel set the box down very carefully, like it might break, and turned to face her fully. "How do you feel?" he asked, and she loved him for making that the first question, instead of assuming he knew. "Shocked," Vivian said honestly. "Terrified, happy, overwhelmed. Like maybe I'm dreaming, and I'll wake up and it won't be real." She pressed a hand to her stomach, still flat, still unchanged. "I made peace with not having this. I thought I was okay with it. But now that it's happening, I realize how much I wanted it. How much I wanted to know what it feels like." Nathaniel pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her like he could shield her from the world. "We're going to have a baby," he said, against her hair, and his voice was filled with wonder. "Our baby." Vivian nodded against his chest. "Are you okay with it? I know you said you didn't need more children." He pulled back to look at her, and his eyes were wet. "I said I didn't need more children because I was trying to protect myself from wanting things that might not happen. I was trying to make sure you knew I chose you for you, not for what you could give me. But this—" He touched her stomach gently, reverently. "This is incredible. This is perfect. This is everything I didn't know I wanted." They told the kids the next morning at breakfast. Vivian had been worried about how they'd react, worried they might feel replaced, or less important, or scared of change. But she'd underestimated them. Owen's reaction was immediate and loud. "We're getting a baby? Like a real baby that lives here?" When they confirmed, he'd launched into an elaborate explanation of how he'd teach the baby about dinosaurs, and they could share his room, and it would be the best baby ever. Claire had gone very quiet, her face serious, before asking, "Will you still have time for us? After the baby comes?" Vivian had knelt down to her eye level and said, "Always, every single day. You three are my first children, and nothing will ever change that." Claire had nodded, satisfied, and then announced she wanted to paint a picture for the baby's room. Elijah's response was the most considered. He'd studied Vivian and Nathaniel for a long moment, then said, "This is really good. I mean, we're already a family. But now we'll be even more of one, and the baby will have what we didn't, a mom from the very beginning." He'd paused, looking suddenly vulnerable despite his usual composure. "That makes me happy. That our brother or sister won't have to wonder what it's like." Nathaniel had gotten up from the table and hugged his oldest son, and Vivian had seen them both crying quietly, while Owen continued his dinosaur monologue, and Claire started sketching baby pictures. 6 months later, Vivian stood in the newly painted nursery, a soft sage green, her third choice just like last time, but this time it would get used, with her hand on her very pregnant belly. The baby kicked, strong and persistent, and she smiled. Outside, spring was turning Boston green again. Through the walls, she could hear Nathaniel helping Elijah with a school project. Claire singing to herself while she drew, Owen explaining something to his dinosaur in great detail, the sounds of her family, her home. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway, drawn by some instinct that told him she was thinking too hard about things. "You okay?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. Vivian leaned into him, his arm coming around her shoulders automatically. "I'm thinking about how strange life is," she said. "A year and a half ago I was signing divorce papers and being told I wasn't enough, that I was broken." Nathaniel turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her face. "You were never broken," he said firmly. "The Ashfords were too stupid to see what they had. Their loss became my gain." He pressed a kiss to her forehead, then her cheek, then her lips. "You gave me my family back. You taught my kids what it means to be loved unconditionally. You showed me that trust isn't weakness. And now you're giving us one more person to love." His hand joined hers on her belly, feeling the baby kick. "But even if this hadn't happened, even if you'd never gotten pregnant, you'd still be everything we needed. Do you understand that?" Vivian nodded, tears spilling over. Happy tears, the kind she was getting used to. "I do," she said. "I really do." That night, after dinner and homework and bedtime stories, after tucking in 3 excited children who kept asking when the baby would arrive, Vivian and Nathaniel sat together in the living room. The city lights sparkled beyond the windows. Somewhere in the apartment, a clock ticked steadily. And Vivian thought about the marble lobby of the Ashford estate, where she'd signed away 8 years of trying to be someone else. She thought about her grandmother Eleanor's letter, "Build something beautiful." She thought about 3 children who'd never known a mother, and a man who'd taught himself not to trust, and how they'd all somehow found each other in the broken places. "You know what's funny?" Vivian said, her head on Nathaniel's shoulder. "The Ashfords rejected me for being barren. They made me feel like I had no value because I couldn't give them children." She paused, feeling the weight of irony and grace. "But you chose me, even though you already had 3 children, and didn't need more. You chose me for me. And somehow, that choice created space for a miracle none of us saw coming." Nathaniel's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing. "They threw away gold because they didn't know what they were looking at," he said quietly. "Their loss. My gain. Our gain." He turned to look at her, and his smile was the kind that reached his eyes, something she'd had to teach him how to do. "I love you, Vivian Breslin, all of you. The parts you thought were broken, and the parts you've discovered are whole. Every single piece." Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Inside, a family built from broken pieces and second chances settled into the evening's quiet peace. In a few months, there would be a baby, a daughter, they'd learned, who would be named Eleanor after the grandmother who'd known Vivian's worth when no one else did. Claire was already planning elaborate welcoming ceremonies. Owen had designated himself as the official dinosaur educator. Elijah was reading parenting books, because of course he was. And Nathaniel had started woodworking in the evenings, building a cradle with his own hands, because he wanted his daughter to have something made with love rather than bought with money. But that was the future. Right now, in this moment, Vivian was simply here, in a home that felt like home, with a man who'd learned to trust again, with children who called her mom without hesitation, with a life she couldn't have imagined when she'd walked out of that law office into an October afternoon that felt like an ending. It turned out it had been a beginning all along. The Ashfords had thrown her away like something defective, but Nathaniel Breslin and his 3 beautiful children had seen her not as broken, but as exactly what they needed. And in choosing each other, in building this strange, imperfect, perfect family from the pieces no one else wanted, they'd all discovered something more valuable than the polished lives they'd been told to want. They'd found home. not in marble lobbies or prestigious names or perfect circumstances, but in showing up for each other, day after ordinary day, choosing love over fear and trust over safety, and hope over the scars that had tried to teach them not to hope. Vivian rested her free hand on her belly, feeling their daughter shift and kick, already impatient to join this family that had learned to make room for miracles. And she smiled, thinking about the words she'd tell this baby girl someday when she was old enough to understand. You were the impossible dream, but you came to a family that was built on impossible dreams coming true. Welcome home, little one. Welcome to the family that chose each other.